Angry father slaps daughter across the face during wedding ceremony, shocking guests, but the groom's unexpected reaction changes everything. From a very young age, Angela learned that her desires didn't matter. Thinking for herself was a luxury that was never granted to her. Her father, Larry, wasn't a man who asked for permission or considered opinions. He decided, and his decisions were indisputable. Not because they made sense or took others' well-being into account, but because no one dared to question him. His presence was enough to crush any resistance before it even emerged. He didn't need to raise his voice or raise his hand often. A glance, a heavy silence, a simple gesture was enough for everyone to understand that his will was absolute. That's how it was at home. Her mother, always silent and obedient, never opposed him, and Angela learned that her only option was to accept. Accept and follow the orders that were given to her, and that's how it had been her whole life. That's how she also knew she would get married. It wasn't a surprise nor a shock, because the idea of belonging to someone had never occurred to her. Marriage was an inevitable step, as predictable as the day they told her what she should study or when they decided which clothes she would wear. No one asked if she wanted it. They just told her. They said Jonathan was the chosen fiancé and that the union would be advantageous for everyone. The information was given with the same coldness as announcing something irrelevant, as if it were a detail of no importance. And Angela, as always, accepted without showing any reaction, not because she agreed, but because she had learned not to react. Jonathan wasn't a stranger, and perhaps that was what made it even more suffocating. He had always been present at events, formal dinners, in the social circles where only those who mattered had a place. He came from an influential family, with a strong, respected name, someone who fit perfectly into what her father considered ideal. He was a well-groomed man, polite, without excess. His posture was always impeccable, his words chosen with precision, his presence discreet and firm. He never paid much attention to her, not even when their eyes met at social occasions. He seemed indifferent, not rudely, but simply because he saw no need to go deeper than necessary. To him, Angela wasn't a woman who had captured his interest, but rather a smart decision, a name on a contract, a piece within an agreement between families. The wedding was set. The date was defined without Angela having any say in the matter, like everything in her life. From that moment on, the house turned into an organizing center. Stylists, event organizers, decorators, and chefs came and went like cogs in a well-oiled machine, each playing their part without ever consulting her. The dress was chosen by specialists who presented options to her mother, who in turn simply nodded and selected what seemed most appropriate. It was an extravagant, lacy, luxurious dress, designed not to reflect Angela's tastes, but to exalt the family name, to reinforce the perfection of the ceremony in front of the guests. The jewelry was inherited from past generations, carefully selected to convey status. The reception venue was booked before she was even informed. Invitations were sent to people she barely knew, all chosen based on their social utility. It was a spectacle, and Angela was the main ornament. But as the preparations progressed, something inside her began to change. Until then, she had accepted everything without questioning. She had never had illusions of choice, never believed she could decide her own fate. But now, with the date approaching, the certainty that her life was being sealed with a final sentence began to weigh in a way it never had before. After the wedding, what would her life be like? She would wake up every day next to Jonathan, follow the routines imposed by a new family, trade her father's authority for her husband's. Her days would be filled with formal dinners, social engagements, and obligations she hadn't chosen. Her opinions would still not matter. Her desires would continue to be suppressed. And then, what would come next? Would it be like this forever? The thought disturbed her in a way it never had before. She had never had illusions about freedom, but now, for the first time, she felt the weight of what it meant to be trapped. The wedding day arrived like a rehearsed play. The venue chosen for the ceremony was grand, an imposing building that reflected the grandeur Larry demanded. The main hall was decorated with flowers arranged in impeccable arrangements, planned to convey sophistication and tradition. The benches were perfectly aligned, forming symmetrical rows. At the altar, an arch of delicate flowers symbolized the union that was about to take place. The musicians were already in place, adjusting their instruments. The sound of the guests arriving, their shoes echoing on the floor. The greetings were polite, full of formal smiles and calculated handshakes. Men and women dressed in impeccable outfits exchanged discreet compliments, commenting on the flawless organization of the event, while the young couples from high society analyzed the occasion as a strategic milestone, an event that solidified ties between two influential families. At the church entrance, Larry stood, impeccable in a tailor-made suit, shaking hands with the arriving guests. His expression was confident, his smile controlled. He was a man who knew that this wedding was not just a ceremony, but a reflection of his own authority and prestige. "Welcome. It's an honor to have you here on this special day," Larry said to a couple arriving, shaking the man's hand firmly. "The honor is ours, Larry," replied the man, an influential businessman, before casting a quick glance at the interior of the church. "Everything is magnificent, just as expected." "Naturally," Larry responded with a half-smile. "After all, I accept nothing less than perfection for my daughter." More guests arrived, and he repeated the same ritual, greeting them with the same formality and unquestionable authority. Some praised the choice of location, others commented on the groom, but no one dared to question the real reason behind the union. Everyone knew that Angela's wedding was not a fairy tale, but a carefully planned agreement. And still, no one would oppose it. Meanwhile, in a back room of the church, Angela was surrounded by a team of women working to make her flawless. Hairdressers shaped her hair, while makeup artists touched up her skin with surgical precision. Stylists adjusted the final details of the dress, making sure every lace, every stitch was in the right place. She was treated like a precious porcelain piece, an ornament to be displayed for the world. But inside, everything about her was broken. The mirror before her reflected an image that seemed to belong to someone else. The woman dressed in white, adorned with jewels, everything about her was beauty and elegance. But the expression in her eyes contradicted the illusion created around her. There was something there, something no one could see. Her thoughts were restless. No matter how much she tried to maintain the same resigned acceptance as always, something inside her was stirring. The wedding, once an abstract idea, was becoming real with every passing second. She could no longer ignore the weight of what it meant to say yes at that altar. She could no longer pretend that leaving that church, her life wouldn't be irrevocably sealed. She would live with Jonathan, sleep beside him every night, wake up in a house she didn't choose, within a routine she didn't plan. She would be presented as his wife at social events, wear clothes chosen to project the ideal image of a successful couple. She would share a life with him without ever truly belonging to herself. There would be no space for her desires, no room for questions. Her surname would change, but her prison would remain the same. He wasn't a cruel man, he wasn't violent, he wasn't cold. But he also wasn't someone who looked at her beyond what was necessary. To Jonathan, Angela was just a piece completing a bigger picture, a name added to his, a link that strengthened his position. And to her, he was a destiny from which there was no escape. The life that stretched ahead of her was a path without forks. Her future was already drawn, and after that ceremony, there would be no turning back. She would move from her father's authority to her husband's, swapping one dominance for another, becoming a married woman, a wife, a quiet shadow next to a man who always knew what he wanted, while she never even had the chance to find out. The thought tightened her chest, like a knot being pulled tight, suffocating her from the inside out. She felt the delicate hands of one of the stylists adjust her veil over her shoulders with meticulous precision. "You look stunning," the woman said, smiling genuinely, as if truly believing that this moment was one of pure happiness. Angela nodded. She didn't answer. She didn't know what to say, perhaps because nothing needed to be said. A gentle knock on the door broke the silence in the room. One of the ceremony organizers appeared with a polite, restrained smile and announced that it was time. Her heart skipped uncomfortably. The moment had arrived. There was no more delay, no more time to think. The wedding would stop being a meticulously drawn plan and become real. The entire hall fell silent as the large doors of the church opened. The music began. Angela took a deep breath, trying to ignore the crushing weight in her chest, and took the first step. The aisle seemed to stretch ahead of her, yet, at the same time, each step brought her closer to an irreversible point. All eyes were on her, faces shining with expectation, admiration, fascination with the impeccable spectacle they were witnessing. The perfect bride, the perfect ceremony, the ideal wedding, but no one saw the truth. No one noticed what was really happening behind the veil of delicacy covering her face. Her feet continued moving out of pure inertia, as if her body knew what to do, while her mind wrestled with the one certainty she had ever had: a future that didn't belong to her. Jonathan was waiting for her at the altar. His suit was impeccable, his posture unshakable. The smile he offered was brief, polite, calculated. To him, this was a long-awaited moment, a logical step in the path laid out. He didn't show any nervousness or hesitation. He would play his part, as he always had, as he always would. The priest began the ceremony. His voice echoed solemnly, guiding each part of the ritual with precision. The words flowed in a rehearsed rhythm, conducting the ceremony impeccably. Jonathan answered when necessary, his voice firm, clear, without a trace of doubt. Then the vows arrived. The priest turned to Jonathan first. "Jonathan, do you take Angela as your wife, promising to love and respect her every day of your life?" "Yes, I do," Jonathan said without hesitation, his answer echoing effortlessly through the hall. The guests smiled discreetly, satisfied with the well-conducted formality. The priest then turned to Angela. "Angela, do you take Jonathan as your husband, promising to love and respect him every day of your life?" Silence fell over the church. She opened her mouth. No words came out. The question hung in the air, waiting for her response. She could say yes, she could say no. For the first time in her life, she had a real choice before her. Time seemed to slow down. The gazes began to shift from expectation to confusion. A discreet whisper passed among the guests. Jonathan turned his face slightly, his smile disappearing, a look of confusion appearing in his eyes. And then, Angela said nothing. The entire church held its breath. The seconds stretched like an eternity. The silence wasn't a lapse, wasn't hesitation, it was a challenge. In the first row of guests, Larry stood abruptly. The sound of the chair scraping echoed through the church, interrupting any attempt to maintain solemnity. His eyes were dark, his expression full of contained fury, threatening to unleash at any moment. The hall remained in absolute silence as Larry advanced, each step echoing on the floor with a weight that made the air feel thick, suffocating. His face was contorted with rage, his eyes fixed on Angela as if her silence were an unforgivable affront. His fists were clenched, and the rigid tension in his shoulders betrayed that his patience had run out. The entire room seemed to freeze, each guest holding their breath, sensing the storm that was about to break. He stopped in front of her, and for a brief moment, time seemed to hesitate. His eyes narrowed, examining his daughter as if looking for an explanation for the outrage she had just committed. But there was no explanation that would satisfy him. Larry raised his hand. The movement was quick, decisive, without hesitation. A moment of anticipation and then the slap. The impact was sharp, brutal. The force of the strike made Angela's head jerk sharply to the side. The sound of the crack echoed through the hall, like thunder cracking inside the silent church. Her skin burned instantly, a sharp sting spreading across her face, but the pain wasn't just physical. It was something deeper. Shock took over the church. There was a collective gasp, a quiet murmur of disbelief and horror. Some people put their hands over their mouths, others shifted in their seats, as if about to stand, but paralyzed by the tension of the moment. And then, before any other reaction could spread, Jonathan moved. No one was faster than him. There was no hesitation. His body moved before his mind could process it. In an instant, he was beside Angela, his eyes locked on Larry with an intensity he had never felt before. His chest rose and fell quickly, his breath accelerating from the indignation that flowed hot through him. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. "Have you lost your mind?" Jonathan said, his voice filled with rage. Larry slowly turned to him, as if only now noticing the presence of the fiancée. His gaze was full of fury and authority, but Jonathan didn't retreat. "This doesn't concern you," Larry said, his voice deep and cold, as if he still controlled the situation. Jonathan let out a short, humorless laugh, a dry sound that reflected his utter contempt. "Doesn't concern me?" he repeated, his voice gaining strength. "You just slapped your daughter at the altar, in front of hundreds of people, at your own wedding, and you think this doesn't concern me?" Larry narrowed his eyes, his gaze hard, his fists clenched. "This is a family matter. You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Jonathan replied, his voice low but firm. "I understand that you think you can control her life forever, that you can force her to do what you want, that you can use violence to bend her to your will." He let out a cold laugh. "But you failed. Because for the first time, she didn't obey you, and that's what really infuriates you, isn't it?" Larry's facial muscles tightened. His gaze was a mix of hatred and disbelief. "You don't know anything about this family," he said, his voice full of threat. "If this is what you call family, then no, I don't know anything about it," Jonathan responded, his tone full of disgust. "And I don't want to." Without another word, Jonathan reached for his own ring. With a brusque gesture, he removed the gold ring from his finger and held it for a moment, observing the small metal circle between his fingers. The entire hall held its breath. Then he let it go. The sound of the ring hitting the altar echoed through the hall like a final verdict. The metallic noise seemed to carry the weight of everything that had happened. There was no turning back. The marriage was over. Not because Angela hesitated, but because Larry, with his own act of brutality, had destroyed any possibility that something real could exist there. The silence that followed was suffocating. Larry remained still, his expression a mix of shock and anger. He looked at Jonathan as if he couldn't believe that anyone dared to challenge him like this. "This is a mistake," he said finally, his voice lower, full of venom. "No, the mistake was believing I would go along with this," Jonathan responded, his voice cold, definitive. "You can control many things, Larry, but you can't control people's dignity. And today, you lost yours in front of everyone." Larry breathed deeply, his chest rising as if about to explode, but there was nothing he could say. Jonathan then turned to Angela. His expression, previously full of indignation, softened for a moment. There was no more anger in his eyes, only a silent acknowledgement of what this meant. He took a deep breath, his posture relaxing slightly before speaking, his voice lower but still firm. "I'm sorry, Angela," he said, looking directly into her eyes. I always knew this marriage was arranged, that it wasn't born of love or of your choice. But somehow, I tried to believe that maybe over time we could find some happiness in this, that maybe, somehow, I could make you happy." He paused briefly, studying her carefully. "But after what I saw today, after what your father did, I understand that what you need is not a husband, but freedom." Before Angela could respond, Larry, still motionless at the altar, huffed in irritation and took a step forward. "You don't have the right to say that," he said, his voice cutting, full of authority. "This marriage can still be—" "This is between me and her," Jonathan interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade, his gaze, cold and resolute, fixed on Larry. "You have nothing more to say about it." Larry's expression hardened, his mouth opening to retort, but Jonathan took another step toward him and pointed with a slight movement of his head at the guests. "Look at them," he said, his voice now lower but heavy with weight. "See what you've done." For the first time since the ceremony began, Larry shifted his gaze away from his daughter and the groom, turning to face the audience. He saw the faces of the people who had once revered him, people who bowed before his presence. But now, what he saw was completely different. Some wore expressions of pure shock, others of disgust. Some women had tears in their eyes. A few men whispered to each other, disapproving of what they had just witnessed. No one looked at him with respect anymore. There was only disdain, discomfort, condemnation. The realization hit him like a blow. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his actions falling upon him. The absolute control he had always had was slipping away before his eyes. Jonathan turned back to Angela and extended his hand once more. "The marriage is over," he said, his voice gentle now, "and you are free. I don't offer you a future bound to me, but I offer you my friendship, if you want to accept it." Angela looked at that extended hand. No one had ever offered her something like that before. She had always been told what to do, always controlled, used as a pawn in plans that were not hers. Her heart raced, her throat tightened. Slowly, with trembling hands, she took it. Tears filled her eyes, and her voice came out low, full of emotion. "Thank you," she said, holding his hand lightly. "No one has ever done this for me before." Jonathan's eyes brightened for a moment, and he nodded without saying anything. Angela took a deep breath, and with a deliberate gesture, she reached for the veil covering her head and slowly removed it. The light fabric slid through her hair, her fingers letting it fall until it touched the ground without ceremony. It was a weight she no longer wanted to carry. Without looking back, she began to walk toward the exit of the church side by side with Jonathan. Each step felt lighter than the last. Behind her, Larry recovered from his shock and took a step forward, his voice full of rage. "Angela!" he shouted, his voice reverberating through the hall. "You'll regret this. You're throwing your life away." She kept walking. "You're ungrateful." His voice faltered, losing strength. "I did everything for you, and this is how you repay me." But this time, silence was not her ally. A murmur began among the guests, and soon some voices rose. "Monster," muttered a woman among the benches. "What a shame," a man said in a low tone, shaking his head. "He slapped his own daughter." The words kept spreading, some people starting to rise and leave, others looking at him with pure contempt. The humiliation suffocated him. The empire of respect he had built throughout his life was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Angela and Jonathan crossed the large doors of the church and stepped out into the daylight. The fresh air surrounded her, and for the first time, she breathed without feeling an overwhelming weight on her chest. She didn't know what the future held for her. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but she knew with unshakable certainty that she would never return to that house. The first few months were difficult. Freedom, once a distant concept, was now an unknown territory. There were no more orders to follow, no expectations to meet. Scary, but at the same time fascinating. She allowed herself to make mistakes, learn and restart. Far from the weight of the past, she began to rebuild herself, brick by brick, like someone who, for the first time, chose her own path. Over time, she and Jonathan met a few times, not as former fiancés, but as two people who, in different ways, had their lives changed in that church. A friendship blossomed between them, something genuine, without imposed expectations. Angela knew she owed a lot to him. He hadn't just refused to be complicit in Larry's control, but with his attitude, he showed her that there was another path, a path she chose to walk. Meanwhile, Larry saw his world crumble bit by bit. Public humiliation isolated him. The man who had always been feared was now avoided. His name, once synonymous with power and respect, was now whispered with disdain. The marriage that was supposed to seal his influence became the mark of his ruin. He tried to regain control. He tried to bring Angela back, but she never responded to his messages. She never answered his calls. Time passed, and he realized too late that his daughter wouldn't return. Angela never looked back. Not because she wanted to forget everything she had lived, but because she knew her future wasn't in the shadows of the past. The day she left that church was the day she was reborn. And for the first time in her life, she felt no fear. She felt freedom. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.